Thank you so much. Couldn't be more grateful to see you all out here this evening. Friday night, party night, and you're here with us, so. Well, there's always the after party. Thank you so much for coming. You know, I want to start out by just asking you a question. I want to hear a little bit about what brought you to this event tonight, and then hopefully reflect on that together for just a moment. Then I'm going to shout out some headlines, just some of the top line ideas that come from the book that we'll be able to dig in more detail with Naomi. And then if there's time, I'm hoping to read you a couple of paragraphs from the book that I'm kind of fond of, and I thought I'd really like to share with you tonight. So let me start out by asking you a question. First of all, I need a scribe. I need a volunteer to be a scribe. Is there anyone who has a pencil and paper handy where they could be a scribe for me? Come on, baby, don't be shy. Oh, perfect, front row and everything. Okay, you are elected. What is your name, sir? David, thank you so much. All right, I'll tell you your task in just a minute, David. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is think about what brought you out here. Hi, everybody up there. What brought you out? What brought you out here tonight? What brought you out here tonight? What concern? What question? What feeling? What brought you out here tonight? And just contemplate that for a moment, and then reduce that to one word. Just want to get that down to one word. And when you've got that word, please shout it out, and David's going to write it down. Okay, here we go. Go ahead. Fear. What? Fear, privacy, intrusion. What came over here? Paranoia. Solidarity. Responsibility. Curiosity. Okay. Wait. Democracy, empowerment, behavior. How are you doing, David? Okay. All right. So, all right. Let's cut David some slack here, will you please? All right. All right. Are you caught up, David? Empowerment, democracy, paranoia, fear. Yep. Okay. We're good then. Slavery. Defense.
Free.
What was that?
Free. What is free?
What is free?
Free.
Free.
Collaboration.
Collaboration.
Parasite.
Parasites. Corporatization. Okay, let's let David catch up. Revolution, that's a good one. Tell me when you get to revolution. Wait a minute, tell me when you get to revolution, David. Okay, good. All right. Well, what is that? Understanding. Okay. Resistance. All right. I think we're getting the gist. So, here's what I want to share with you. These are very important and evocative words, and they bear right down to the center of our lives, don't they? The way I look at it, the titanic struggles of capital in the 20th century bore down on the economic domain. They bore down on our workplaces, and they bore down on us in our economic roles as consumers and as employees, as workers. In our era, in our time, these titanic struggles of capital are not just bearing down on the economic domain. They bear down fully on society, on the social domain, on our bodies, on our everyday lives, in our homes, in our cars, on our streets, in our cities. They are part of the fabric of our everyday life, out of the economic domain into the social domain. bearing down on our very bodies and our lives. They call us users. What does that even mean? Could there be a less meaningful word on earth? They call us users. But here's something I want to tell you. I brought this for you. So I've been in, my book was published a few weeks ago, early January, mid-January. And I've been on the road pretty much all that time. So I've been in 3 countries, 6 cities, and I started asking this question of my audiences pretty early on in all these different locales. Let me tell you what other people said when I asked them this question, other groups. Sovereignty, determinism, fear, resistance, inequality, bias, revolution, dignity, autonomy, democracy, manipulation. Another group, anxiety, manipulation, control, identity, freedom, resistance, power, democracy, law. You hear the echoes? They call us users. And yet here we are across countries, across cities, experiencing so many of the same concerns. I say we are not users. I say we are bound in new psychological, social, political, as well as economic interests. That we have not yet invented the words to describe the ways that we are bound. We have not yet invented the forms of collective action to express the interests that bind us. And that is a big part of the work that must follow in this year and the next year and the year after that, if we are to ultimately interrupt and outlaw what I view as a pernicious rogue capitalism that has no business dominating our society. In the year 1833 in Britain, as the industrial capitalism was just emerging, when they talked about the social hierarchy in Britain, they had 2 terms, the aristocracy and the lower classes. There was no one else. So whether you were a banker or a pauper, a merchant, whatever, you were all part of the lower classes. I submit to you that that is a parallel to the term users. We are just right now in this catch-all of the lower classes, but soon what will emerge is what emerged a century ago, the idea that there are workers, that there are laborers, that they have interests, and that they will organize around those interests. That there are consumers, and they have interests, and they will act according to their interests. Consumers perpetrated the American Revolution. Laborers fought for enfranchisement and the establishment of real democracy in Britain. These were powerful roles, and we will find our own. What is surveillance capitalism? Surveillance capitalism diverges from the history of capitalism in many, many ways. But here, in this big pattern, it follows the history of capitalism. Let me describe it this way. Throughout capitalism, as historians have observed, throughout its history, capitalism claims things that live outside the market dynamic, and it brings them into the market dynamic so that they can become commodities to be sold and purchased. Everybody understands this, right? Industrial capitalism claimed nature for the market dynamic, that it could be reborn as real estate, as land, to be sold, to be purchased. It claimed work for the market dynamic, that it could be reclaimed as labor, wage labor, to be sold and purchased. Surveillance capitalism follows in this pathway, but with a dark and strange twist. because now surveillance capitalism went in search of the last virgin wood. And what it found was private human experience. And what it does is to unilaterally claim private human experience for the market dynamic, that it can be reborn as behavioral data. Private human experience claimed as a free source of raw material to be reborn as behavioral data. In the logic of surveillance capitalism, these behavioral data are sent into its production processes, elaborate supply chains that capture these behavioral data from every aspect of our lives and activities, channel these data into new production processes that are called what? Artificial intelligence, machine intelligence, all of that. And out of this black box emerges surveillance capitalism's products. Its products are predictions. I call them prediction products. They are predictions of our behavior, predictions of what we will do now, soon, and later. Turns out many, many businesses have an interest in this knowledge. And these new businesses form a new kind of marketplace that trades exclusively in these predictions. Call them behavioral futures. Now, as everybody knows, this whole logic was born and raised in the context of online targeted advertising. And for a long time we thought, oh, this is online targeted advertising. This is the only way advertising can be in the digital. And we adapted and found ways to live with this idea of targeted ads. But what we really didn't think about was the way in which online targeted advertising represents this sequence that I've just described to you. In this case, what Google learned to do was to predict a piece of future behavior, namely a click-through rate probability. That's a piece of future behavior. And what those advertisers are buying in their ad auctions is essentially they're making bets on these predictions of future behavior. That's how it works. This logic, this economic logic, born in Google, elaborated in Google, becoming successful in Google, only did we learn how successful when Google IPO'd in the year 2004, and we discovered that in 1996, 1996, when its revenues were 86 million, I knew there was an 86 in there, its revenues were 86 million. Between that year and 2004, when its revenues were 3.2 billion, it actually increased its revenue line by 3,590%. On the strength of these discoveries and this economic logic. So as we begin to understand the economic logic, that's part of the work of my book, as we begin to understand its economic imperatives, what happens is we begin to walk back from the wonderland in which they have put us. And as Alice went through the looking glass into the wonderland, we get to walk backwards through the looking glass, out of the wonderland, into the real world, where we can start to see things clearly without the fog of rhetoric and obfuscation and euphemism, mendacity and misdirection that have become second nature to the propagandists of surveillance capitalism. And as we walk back, we start to see some things. Like, for example, we thought that they were free, that their products and services were free for us. But all the time that we're thinking that they're free, they're thinking that we're free. We're the free raw material. Get them engaged, get them engaged, get them engaged. Keep that data flowing, keep it flowing. Get them engaged anywhere and everywhere, it doesn't matter. Call it a car, call it a house. Call it a digital assistant, call it a thermostat, call it a search engine, it doesn't matter. Call it social media, it doesn't matter. Get them engaged, keep the data flowing, complex supply chains flowing to production. We thought we were using social media, but social media was using us. We thought we were searching Google, but Google was searching us. Thank you. We thought that these companies had privacy policies, but in fact these companies have surveillance policies. And we became all too vulnerable to something that they told us over and over and over again. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. When the fact is, and how many of us have lost our bearings on this, when the fact is that if you have nothing to hide, then you are nothing. Because everything that you are, the place inside you, your inner resources from which you draw your sense of identity, your sense of voice, your sense of autonomy and moral judgment, your ability to think critically, to resist, even to revolt. These are the capabilities that can only be grown within. Jean-Paul Sartre calls it the will to will. And that will to will grows from within, and you should hide it, and you should cherish it, and it should be private, and it should be yours. So they've destabilized our moral bearings and our sense of self. And what we discover when we learn about the economic imperatives of surveillance capitalism is that these imperatives, it's not that there are all bad people in these companies. These imperatives compel these corporations. They compel these corporations to enter a collision course with democracy. A collision course with democracy. And this happens from below and it happens from above. From below, democracy is diminished because ultimately surveillance capitalists discovered in the heat of competition that the most powerful predictive data come from actually influencing our behavior towards its preferred outcomes. We'll talk more about that with Naomi. But just let me give you that top line for now to say that in order to fulfill its own economic imperatives, surveillance capitalism must undermine human autonomy. It must rob us of decision rights over our own private experience. Is that 15? 5 left? Okay, good to know. So from below, it's eroding autonomy. It's eroding the principles of individual sovereignty because it's eroding our decision rights, our control over our own experience, its boundaries, its inwardness. I call these the right to the future tense and the right to sanctuary. These are being eroded from below, and without these, a flourishing democratic society is impossible. But it also challenges democracy from above, because it means that we enter the 21st century, and all of us are already preoccupied, stressed, worried, being activists, writing, thinking, helping, doing whatever we can to figure out how we move past the pernicious economic inequality that has scarred our societies. But now, surveillance capitalism means that we enter the 21st century with a wholly new axis of social inequality imposed upon us. And this is the inequality of knowledge. Because with these practices that I have just briefly described so far, what we see is under the aegis of private capital, and specifically private surveillance capital. These companies take control of 21st century society, sporting asymmetries of knowledge, unlike anything the world has seen. Asymmetries of knowledge. They know so much about us. We know so little about them. We do not know about us what they know about us. They have so much knowledge that is from us, but that knowledge is not for us. These asymmetries of knowledge produce equally pernicious asymmetries of power, the power that accrues from this knowledge. Specifically, and I hope we get into this discussion with Naomi, specifically the power to command the digital milieu, to command this capitally intensive, ubiquitous digital infrastructure that now saturates our lives, to command that in order to not only know us, track us, monitor us from where we are and where we go, to our posture and our gait and our faces and the muscles that express themselves in our faces and give away our emotions, of finding our personality profiles in the exclamation points and bullet points that we leave in our online posts. But they go beyond that to influence and modify our behavior at the scale of populations. What is this power? This power to actually influence populations, unauthorized, self-regulated, without democracy's oversight, without democracy's participation, without our knowledge. Systems that are specifically engineered to keep us in ignorance. Systems that are specifically engineered and celebrated for their ability to bypass our awareness. Ergo, my friends, surveillance capitalism. It's not a word chosen lightly. It's a word chosen because this capital cannot accumulate without the social relations of the one-way mirror. Because when we know about it, and if we have a choice, they are over. You know, I write about the phenomenon of the unprecedented. The unprecedented. When you really encounter something that is unprecedented in your experience, it is almost impossible to recognize it. It's like you can't actually see it. Because when you encounter something unprecedented, you're looking for things out of your experience, things that are already familiar to you, as a way of grasping, of taking in what you're actually seeing. So, you know, for example, the whole idea of the horseless carriage, right? So you've got an automobile, which is a wholly new thing, quite unprecedented, and for a long time people called it a horseless carriage, rubricizing it, you know, to stuff that was familiar. That's how the unprecedented works. So I try to think about the unprecedented a lot, and I've spent a good part of my life in South America, and I'm just countries that are very dear to my heart, and I think a lot about the first indigenous peoples and what was their encounter with the first Spaniards that they ever saw. And you know, there are accounts where they see these ships and they think that there are mountains riding on the seas. And then these strange men with their hair and their beards and their brocades and their armors, and they think there's some kind of gods coming down from these mountains that somehow ride on the sea. So this shock of the unprecedented. And obviously the interaction of the Spanish conquistadores and their impact on the indigenous peoples, this is the most painful history to read, a history of death and destruction, of murder, of just unimaginable cruelty. And so I honor that, I recognize that. But there are some strange things about the sort of niceties of the conquistadores that fascinated me. For example, back in the court of Isabel and Ferdinand, they decided that, yeah, we're going to take these people's lands and their gold and everything else, their lives and their labor, but we want to do it legally. It would be nice to do it legally.
There should be some kind of piece
It
of
should
paper.
be legal. Let's make it legal. So they needed a way to make it legal. So the monarchs put their head together with the Pope and their lawyers, and they came up with something called the requerimiento, which is an edict written in Castilian Spanish of the 15th century, and intended to be read to the villagers. And it goes on in legalese. In the name of the Queen and the King and the Pope, we take you and your lands and so forth. And then it goes all around, and then at the very end, it basically says, and if you don't agree, then we have the right to burn and pillage and rob and steal and kill and maim and all the things that they indeed did do.
And it's a language that is not understood by the people they're presenting.
So they come to the village and they pull out the edict and they read it in Castilian Spanish to indigenous peoples who think that they're looking at some kind of strange gods that have emerged from somewhere across the horizon, who have no idea, of course, what they're saying. And the one monk who bears witness to these things, Bartolome, he says that he never saw any translator there, any effort to translate. Is this reminding you of anything? Because it should be. Every time you click that little box, I agree. And they say, well, they agreed to it. And you hear Eric Schmidt with that little mantra, and we will take and know everything about you with your permission. Yes. And we will take your life and know everything about you and about your friends and about where you're coming and where you're going, with your permission, of course. And permission is that little tick. And that little tick, what are we ticking on? We're ticking on the 21st century version of the requerimiento, the legal edict that we cannot understand, written in a language designed to keep us ignorant, along with so many other things about their practices.